Welcome. Today, we are delving into a dramatic tale from the Middle Ages, a story of supposed martyrs and a brutal crusade. But what if I told you that the very people at the heart of this story, the Cathars, may not have existed at all, at least not in the way we've been led to believe?
This is the dramatic climax of the legend, the story of the Cathars, the so-called pure ones. The narrative we all know is of these heroic heretics in southern France who held a dualist faith. They saw the world, you see, as a cosmic battle between a good god of the spirit and an evil god of the material world. And for holding this belief, they were, in the end, utterly crushed by the Catholic Church.
It's an incredibly powerful image, isn't it? This idea of a tolerance, almost enlightened culture in the beautiful region of Languedoc, completely destroyed by a greedy and dogmatic papacy. And this is the story that has captivated so many of us for centuries. Well, a really radical shift in historical research, coming particularly from French historians, now suggests that the Cathars, as we have come to imagine them, never truly existed. It's a profound claim, so let's unpack it. To really deconstruct this entire myth, we have to start with the most basic element of all, the name Cathar itself. The name itself sounds so noble, doesn't it? The pure ones. It immediately evokes this image of spiritual purity and righteousness. But here's the fundamental problem with this label. That's right. When you actually dig into the medieval records, and especially into the files from the Inquisition, you find no evidence whatsoever that the people of southern France ever called themselves Cathars. They actually saw themselves simply as true Christians. They used these humble, very straightforward terms to describe their communities which were really focused on living a life of gospel poverty and simplicity. You see, the term was always an external label, and it was used to marginalize them. It wasn't until the 19th century that a theologian by the name of Charles Schmidt revived the word, applying it as this sort of blanket term for all of these diverse religious movements. And that's when the modern legend of the Cathars truly began to take flight. So if they weren't this single, unified group called the Cathars, then what exactly was this great heresy that the Church was so incredibly determined to destroy? This brings us to a really powerful and quite provocative idea. Historians now argue that the highly organized, supposedly devil-worshipping religion we call Catharism was largely an invention, a discursive fiction that was constructed by the Church in order to demonize what was, in reality, a much more complex situation. This really shows this stark contrast, doesn't it? On one side, you have the fiction created by the Church, a foreign organized threat, supposedly imported from groups like the Bogomils in the Balkans. But the reality that's been uncovered by historians like Jean-Louis Biguet is one of homegrown movements. These were Christians who were disgusted by the wealth of the clergy, and they were demanding a return to apostolic poverty. They weren't anti-Christian at all. You could argue they were trying to be more fundamentally Christian than the establishment itself. And this, of course, is where the theology gets tangled up with politics and power. You see, it was far, far easier to justify a holy war against some foreign, demonic cult than it was against fellow Christians who were simply calling out the Church's own failings. This is exactly why that invention was so crucial. By creating a unified foreign heresy, the Church provided the perfect justification for what was, in reality, a geopolitical project, a crusade for control. So the war on heresy became this ideological cover for what was, in truth, a brutal war of conquest. The cross on the banner became a pretext for seizing land, for seizing treasure, and for seizing power. You have to remember, at the time, the south of France, the region known as Occitania, or the Languedoc, was culturally distinct. It was wealthy, and it was politically quite independent. The Crusade, then, offered the perfect opportunity for the King of France and his northern barons to subjugate this prosperous region and take its lands for themselves. And this timeline just shows how brutally effective that project was. It all begins in 1208, when the murder of a papal legate essentially lights the fuse. The Albigensian Crusade that follows is swift, and it's incredibly violent. By 1229, after only 20 years of war, the independence of the South is completely broken. And with the final, tragic fall of the fortress of Montségur in 1244, the conquest is complete.
So, if the historical reality was this complex series of local religious movements that were crushed by a political land grab, why is the romantic legend of the Cathars still so powerful today? Well, the myth has been invented and then reinvented multiple times. First, you had the Inquisitors creating this monstrous enemy to justify a war. Centuries later, 19th century Romantics rediscovered them and transformed them into mystical heroes. Then, this new image was adopted by regional movements in southern France as a symbol of their unique culture and their historical resistance to Parisian control. And finally, it was packaged for tourism. So, when you visit the stunning castles of southern France today, you're experiencing Cathar country, which is essentially a brand. It's a modern story, an imaginary community that has been carefully constructed from the fragments of a much more complicated and perhaps less romantic past. You know, the invention of the Cathars is a truly fascinating case study. It shows us that history is never just a simple record of what happened. It is a story, and it's shaped by those who tell it, from medieval inquisitors all the way to modern-day tourist boards. And it really forces us to ask ourselves what we seek from the past. Is it the complicated truth, or is it a legend that simply feels true?